Hello, everyone. Welcome back. On today's episode, Amy and I talk about the intersect between Brene Brown's work with shame resilience and internal family systems. We're going to jump right into it. I hope that you enjoy, and thanks always for tuning back in to the Turning In podcast. We really, really appreciate it. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Turning In podcast. I am Megan Jones, one of your hosts here, as always, with Dr. Amy Crawford. Hello, good morning to you.
Hello, good morning, Megan.
Thank you. It is a good morning. And we're going to just dive right into this good morning, talking about shame.
Shame. Dun, dun, dun.
Shame. That wonderful, quite popular topic, I would say, in the last few years. I feel like I've seen it gain a lot of popularity, which I'm really happy about, and we'll kind of talk about a bit of some of the origin and reasoning for that. And as it relates to I.F.S, I'm really intrigued with this conversation just based on how our parts react and respond. But first, let's define shame a little bit. Shame versus guilt. I don't know. Will you kind of talk to us about like what shame is and how it pops up in our like general existence, I suppose?
Sure, Megan. So, to shame, basically, well, let me back up. With shame, the reason it's become so popular is because of the work of Brene Brown, which I'm sure every single one of our listeners has heard her name, if not read several of her books, or seen her TED Talks, or watched her Netflix special or her HBO special. I mean, she's kind of everywhere. She's kind of a big deal, and for rightful, honest, very earnest reasons. But really, Brene Brown is the one who brought this whole conversation of shame into light. So a lot of reverence goes out to her, because I don't think many of us were discussing shame until she brought it into the light. So a lot of this initial discussion around shame will be pulling from all of the research she's done, which is cool. So we didn't have to. So by definition, how she would like to define shame, which also resonates with how I think it's a pretty solid definition, is it's that intensely painful feeling or experience of believing we're flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging, right? Now, if you think of that definition, that's sort of the big broad stroke definition, and anyone I think can probably even break it down further. But yeah, that intensely painful feeling or experience of believing we're flawed and unworthy of love and belonging because we're flawed, we're broken, we're not good enough. All of those words really help encapsulate what shame is per the research. Now, a lot of times what has happened is that we use the two feelings of shame and guilt interchangeably. Mm-hmm. They're very different feelings, actually. Shame is an emotion that there's two emotions that some people will argue this depending upon their neurological background and like neurobiology. But a lot of studies show that there are two emotions that our body feels in a way that our brain doesn't necessarily, because a lot of our emotions come from our brain, whereas shame and rage both are more primitive physical experiences of emotions. And so I don't know why I just went off on that. Felt important for some part of me. Anyhow, with guilt and shame are uniquely different. Shame is that deeply held belief or feeling that we're not good enough. Mm-hmm. Whereas guilt is more of an emotion that comes from behavioral engagements, such as making a mistake, yelling at my daughter. Let's use that example because that rarely happens. Just hypothetically, a part of me gets impatient with my daughter. And it's not uncommon for parts of me to then feel really bad about myself, thinking I'm a worthless parent, I suck, I'm horrible, all of those things, right? Whereas guilt would be, wow, Amy, that behavior is not cool. Like getting impatient with your daughter because she asked you a simple question after you had a long day, not making excuses, but she asked you a simple question and you get snappy with her. That there could be guilt, which is the behavioral element of it, right? Like going, oh, wow, I did something bad, but because I did something bad doesn't mean I am bad. Whereas shame is the I am bad versus I did something bad.
Well, I'm glad that you brought that up, because that's one of, I'm pretty sure, Brene's, kind of like taglines between guilt and shame, that is so, that I think that's one thing that, I mean, she's done so many things wonderfully. Obviously, she's dedicated her life, and we'll get more into, that in a second. And the way that she breaks things down into just layman's terms. Guilt is I did something bad. Shame is I am something bad. And when you were just talking, I'm going to go off on like maybe a little bit of a right term, and something that just sort of came up that I thought was interesting is like, as you were talking about motherhood, it's like we talk about like, or there's that term of like mom guilt, and it's like, actually that's kind of mom shame, because it's not really mom guilt, it's mom shame, because that narrative in our head is, I'm the worst mother on the face of the planet. It's like that deep stuff.
I'm not a good enough mother. I should be doing better.
It's just this huge dramatized narrative. And it's like, I think just to prove your point about sometimes society and people's misunderstanding or misuse of the word, I think that that's a really easy example. It's like we just throw around, oh, I have such mom guilt. I'm just the worst, and I'm never there, and I'm not good enough, and I'll never be the mother that they deserve. And it's like, that's not guilt. That's not guilt.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, good example.
So, anyways, go ahead.
No, and so, I think for our listeners to have that understanding of what shame is, and even what, shame versus guilt is, I think is critical as we dive deeper into how shame and I.F.S. intersect, because Brene Brown has done a million things right. And of course, I mean, at this point, again, I don't know her personally. I'm, done her Daring Way certification and whatnot, so I know her curriculum and know her material pretty closely to my heart and believe in a lot of it. And I do believe that there are some holes in it, right? And that's where I think I.F.S. just makes everything better. I mean, obviously I'm like into I.F.S. hook, line, and sinker. And I think where some of the holes are in even her shame resiliency steps, that's where I.F.S. is like, oh, cool. What do we do with this now? Right. So, Brene has spoken about 4 shame resiliency steps. And, the first being recognizing shame and understanding the triggers. Practicing critical awareness and reality checking is the second step. Reaching out, meaning, shame loves to stay dark. When we expose it to the light, it often changes, manifests, and transforms. And the fourth step being speaking shame, that we actually have to use the word, call it what it is. And per her research, she has found that the critical ingredients to shame resiliency are courage, compassion, and connection. Interesting, right? Sounds a whole lot like self. So when self is in the mix, self energy per I.F.S. would have the capacity to help our internal landscape become more shame resilient when we are intimately, closely looking at, loving up on, and exploring the parts of us that carry shame, right? So if you think of step 1, recognizing shame and understanding the triggers, that sounds a lot like the U-turn in I.F.S. How we take our foot off the pedal, how we turn in to actually notice when parts of us are either acting in ways that make them feel shame, or that they are feeling shame because they dropped the ball, or, at the tip of our inverted balancing act triangle, that exhale energy, that emotional tenderness, vulnerability often is oozing shame, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's that
It's the
energy
not
of, go ahead. Yeah.
not good. Yeah, it's just like that major not good enough, not enough, unworthy. Like that's exile 101.
Yeah, that's exhale energy, like to boot, right?
Yeah.
And really, I might get chastised for this comment. I might get chastised in general since I said Brene Brown's work is amazing and could deepen in certain areas. If you think of most exile energy, regardless, I'm going to be rejected, like rejection, loneliness, abandonment, fear of failure. I mean, those are some of the common things we hear that our exiles carry, the burdens that they carry. A lot of exile burden energy is in fact shame. I mean, right? Like the belief of being abandoned is coming from a place of shame, because why would someone abandon us if we were good enough?
Exactly.
Right. So, so that step one of recognizing shame and understanding the triggers, it comes from that U-turn in I.F.S, the ability to slow down, turn in and go, parts of me are feeling this way or acting in this way. Right. Where that second step of practicing critical awareness and reality checking, that there to me translates in I.F.S to the capacity to be able to have self be with our parts. Because when self is with our parts, one of the C's of self is clarity. Clarity is what allows us to be in a space of critical awareness, to have insight, and to reality check. In I.F.S, we call that reality checking, updating. Right? So it doesn't take much time for me, the 47-year-old who doesn't carry all this pain, to be able to look at my parts and be like, oh, sweet one, you know what? I know that's really, really hard. And I'm 47. I've got this. I can hold this for you. You are lovable and you were born lovable. Right. And so that's that critical awareness and reality checking element of it, and her steps 3 and 4 of reaching out and speaking shame is very similar to what we were just mentioning. Right. Brene speaks a lot about reaching out in terms of like externalizing and going out of yourself to do so. That's lovely and great. However, sometimes that doesn't always work. Sometimes that backfires if you don't actually have a group of phenomenal humans around you that can hold the shame, hold you reaching out without turning the blasted lights on. Right. And the difference there, I think, with I.F.S is, reaching out is great. However, we have to reach in first, in my opinion.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that was one of the kind of questions on my mind, being that one of the steps there is kind of all about connectivity, and that generally, and even Brene talks about the marbles in the jar and making sure that you're doing that with people, like you just said, that aren't going to turn the floodlights on and that understand. And as we're going about this journey, figuring out the difference between guilt and shame and which I'm feeling, and because it really does, for my system, and I would say for the majority, we just talked about, the exile energy of shame. It feels just like this, like pit in my stomach, and this like dripping deep, just heavy, wet blanket. And so when I'm interacting with somebody that doesn't know how to, all intense, all with all positive intention to help me feel better, but when I'm interacting with somebody that doesn't exactly get it or hear it or understand, or whatever, it can sort of backfire. And so
and then there's internal backlash within our system, right? And our parts are like, see, told you so.
Why would you bring this up? See, you can't trust anybody. You're always going to be abandoned. You're always going to feel abandoned. So that was my long tangential way of saying, really glad you brought that up, because one of my questions was about, being able to, I don't want to use the word like heal shame, because that's not exactly what I mean. But quote unquote heal shame through that U-turn and through the internal work with self. And if that was kind of an option, I suppose, sometimes.
Well, I think managing shame in a way that we can effectively pass through it is the hope and the goal, in my opinion.
Oh, I love the way that you worded that. Managing shame in a way that we can pass through it. I really like that. Sorry.
Good. I'm glad you didn't ask me to repeat it, because I don't think I've ever said that line before. So I was like, cool. I don't say, could you say that again? So all of you listeners, pause that, write it down, or listen to it again, because I may not ever be able to access that phrase again. Because shame is an evolutionarily is a feeling of evolution, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it is one that served us really super well way back when we were living in tribes. Mm-hmm. And it helped us from being excommunicated out of a tribe. It kept us in line. It helped us do what was needed and necessary to stay alive way back when. Now we don't have that same tribe mentality at all. And we can be, one can argue we can pretty much live in isolation with no one else around us and survive fine. We may not have a deep, meaningful connection, and we could still survive by survival definition. And so the thing is, shame is so embedded within our systems from a genetic perspective that there's no way we will ever be shame-free. Like, that won't ever happen. So knowing that that's not an option, then how can we actually learn to manage the experience of shame when our parts are feeling it, so that we can move through it in a way that's effective without making things worse, right? Because that gets us into also what parts do when they're feeling shame.
100%. And I mean, as you just laid that out, it goes to show, again, the positive intent of this. Would you say shame is an emotion or an experience? You kind of went into
I
that
think
with
both.
A little bit of both. That's kind of what I
think it can be both.
think.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, we have it. We all have it because it's like part of our neurobiology, because of a positive intent to keep us alive. So what do we do with it today? How is that relevant today?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's where I.F.S does a beautiful job of helping the neurobiological element of shame, so that we can truly work through it, so that it's not impacting our nervous system, creating complete discrepancy in our window of tolerance and causing our parts to behave in ways that really do blow things up, right?
And then lastly, create more shame. Sorry.
Right. Well, no, but exactly, right? And we're going to, I'd love for us to go there here shortly about, like the cycle of shame and what ends up happening internally to that balancing act that we've referenced previously in other episodes, right? But that last step of her speaking shame, I do believe we have to name things to tame them and to really call them what they are, assuming we're calling them what they are in self, and other parts aren't putting their sharp edges around their languaging surrounding an emotion, experience, or physical sensation. And so, so that to me is how I.F.S intersects with Brene's 4 shame resiliency steps, which then I think is a good segue for us, Megan, if you want to chat around, the balancing act and how each of the different categories of our parts carry shame and manifest shame and all that stuff.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think beautiful segue. Beautiful.
Why, thank you.
Well, again, kind of one of the topics that we've talked about, is talked about, and you and I have talked about, is like, we discuss our firefighters and how they're often driven by shame, but that also doesn't mean that we just talked about our exiles and how they often feel the intense experience of shame at their core of not being good enough. But that doesn't also mean that our managers aren't also really secretly draped in shame in some ways as well. So I guess where do you want to go? Do you want to start with a certain category? We sort of talked about exiles and how they're like, at the core of a lot of our exiles, while they are still exiles, parts, it feels like this unworthiness and abandonment and not good
Mhm.
enoughness in whatever way that
Yeah.
presents. I feel like
Yep.
that's pretty clear.
Yeah.
Do you want to go through the managers since they usually present first?
Yeah. So let's just, as we think of it, visualize that triangle that Cease has helped us really understand. And we talk a lot about here in our podcast because it is such a really rich reminder that all parts are in constant interaction and dynamic with each other.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think of this inverted triangle, right, where the tip of the triangle is at the bottom and you got the two sides coming off of it, right? So we've already discussed that exhale energy at the bottom of it. That exhale energy is going to cause our two categories of protectors to act in certain ways to protect it, to keep it safe, to keep it from coming out by whatever means necessary. So yeah, with the managers, as Megan said, our managers are often cloaked in shame. However, their behaviors in which they engage in to preventatively, proactively stop shame from the shame of the exile, let's say, from coming out, their behaviors are not shame driven usually. Their behaviors are really great, and if we think of what Brene says, like pleasing, perfecting, performing, pretending, all of those P's, those are a lot of the proactive, look at all my alliterations today,
Yeah.
proactive managerial roles, responsibilities, duties that those protectors step into to keep shame away, right? So if you think of perfectionism, which a lot of us have bits of, at least, the parts of us that are trying to make everything perfect or stay in control, they're trying to stave off shame by doing so. If I'm good enough, if I'm perfect, then I'm good enough. If I do this perfectly, then I won't look like a fraud or a failure. Then I'll be perceived a different. I'm not trying to be wise with all these P's. They're just coming out.
Poet.
Yeah. So, our managers are working hard not to feel shame. However, if you think of it, they are directly related to shame because that's what they're trying to stave off by whatever they need to do. So then often what ends up happening is then our firefighters come in either to give our managers a break or because the exile energy of shame, if we're using shame as the burden today, kind of the burden we're really focusing on that a lot of our exiles carry, our firefighters will come in and often engage in behaviors that carry shame, which then just is this like self-perpetuating cycle within our system, right? So remembering that some of our firefighters are reactionary, do whatever necessary to put out the threats because they either believe the threat is real, it's there, it's present. So chances are the exile energy is kind of boiling up a little bit more in a way that makes the firefighter feel like they have to do something. And so they'll engage in, say, eating a bag of tortilla chips, as I spoke of a few episodes back, or drinking a few too many drinks, or.
Yeah, right.
Right. Having, maybe a moment where you and your partner are having a hard time. So then you start checking out other options, flirting, all the things that our firefighters do to help us put out the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing we're flawed and therefore unworthy of love. Right. And so if you think of it, they're constantly, my hands, you guys can't see my hands, but it's like this teeter-totter of sorts between all of our parts, working their asses off to try to not feel shame. And to not feel shame, they're engaging in behaviors that they do feel shameful over. And then our managers come in trying to look perfect to keep it all together, right? So it's just this constant cycle, and a lot of this work speaks about shame and addiction being so closely related that you can't determine where one starts and the other begins, right?
Yeah, it's this consistent. It's like just the spinning top that's like,
Yep.
or what are those called? Like a dreidel, that's
Oh,
always trying
yeah.
not to fall over. And that exile energy is always kind of the tippy bottom, like we've talked
Yep.
about. And like UNCs have talked about, it really does translate kind of perfectly into the 4 steps of shame resilience, IFS, and fills in those gaps where where it just fills in the gaps where it's like, take the U-turn, manage your connection. And it doesn't have to be external, like we spoke about. It can
Right.
happen internally. And as we're going throughout the world, I mean, we talked and sort of passed through the topic of the external connection. And as we get to know our system, and are able to move about the external world and self, we will inherently likely choose other people who won't put the floodlight on. And I don't know,
Yeah.
it really does translate, unsurprisingly, very well. Very well.
And if you think of the 4 shame resiliency steps and how we just sort of added to them by intersecting it into IFS, that's just one small piece of how IFS can be beneficial to the parts of us that are carrying shame and are engaging in ways that cause shame. And, that said, then the deepening of that comes when you actually start working with those parts, doing the 6 Fs, getting to the exile that carries some of these burdens to help them unburden. And that's where the neurobiological shift happens. So that sustainable change occurs within our system so that we're not as regularly, perhaps, engaging in this shame cycle, right? Because if we just keep doing those 4 steps, that's cool. But then it's kind of like a Band-Aid on some level, right? Where it's like bringing awareness, shedding some light, speaking it, checking in on the parts, extending some love and compassion to them. I mean, my gosh, it does wonders. And there's just more that can be done.
Yeah, it doesn't an incredible amount, especially as we're just beginning, right? Especially if you're like if you're at the point where you're like just figuring out, because I mean, you and I know this very well, and there are tons of us on the planet that are just learning what we're feeling at all.
Yeah.
Like that are just kind of beginning to identify and come out of that dissociation to some degree, and so I believe, what Brene's done to really turn this into layman's language is incredible. And it doesn't necessarily, like, quote unquote, I don't say that all the time and it really annoys me, so sorry everybody. But it doesn't really treat the problem, so to speak, sustainable, like in a long-term fashion where
it doesn't transform the problem.
Yeah, it just helps us recognize, which is beautiful. It just helps us recognize and get to know, oh, our parts do carry shame. Oh, I do have shame. Oh, shame exists. I don't have to always run from it. And it's actually really important for me to be vulnerable with people and myself and recognize that it's there. And to your point, there isn't a transformation until or unless a deepening takes place.
Well, and as we were just talking, this just came in strong for me, and maybe listeners are like, yeah, duh. Really, those four steps are really the unblending. That's the beginning process of unblending from the parts of us that are showing up carrying shame, right? That's the unblending, right? And then, which is huge and rich and magical, crucial, like we already said, because there's nothing more that can happen without that occurring first. That awareness, that insight has to be there. And then it's that deepening of developing a relationship with these parts. Because if we don't develop the relationship with these parts to really understand what their role is, what their jobs are, what their positive intention is, who it is they're protecting, then we're just going to keep doing this more and more, which is cool and very helpful. And IFS then takes the baton, right?
Well, I can speak to that almost, personally, where I was introduced to shame resilience years before I was introduced to I.F.S.
Mhm.
And that was an incredibly important moment for my system to have that language and be able to recognize. And it does almost, I think the magic really happened once I got into I.F.S. because of exactly what you're saying, where I was walking and moving about the cabin with this awareness that I had the shame and could recognize that it came up, and that was beautiful and wonderful. And I was able to deepen some connections to some
Mhm.
level by speaking it and talking about it and being vulnerable. However, as it continued to come up without any real resolve, it
Right.
almost, my system almost had other managers and parts that carry shame come online where it's like, well, what the hell? This keeps coming up. It's, you
Mhm.
know what I mean? Like it didn't
Mhm.
quite understand to the depth that it does now of where it was coming from and what the origin story was and all of that.
Yeah.
So I think you're
Yeah.
making just really important important points about how they just so seamlessly should and can, or can and should, go together.
Well, and all of the shame resiliency steps are very cerebral if you really think about it, and kind of heady.
Mm,
And I.F.S, since it's a psychospiritual somatic model, it helps bring it out of our head into our bodies and is so deeply experiential
mhm.
when we continue to connect with our parts in the ways that they're carrying shame or how they are in relationship with shame. And that is where the transformation happens.
Yeah. I'm just reflecting on, I don't know that I had kind of like put that fully together about it being so cerebral.
Mm-hmm.
And it really is, because it is all about kind of like organizing the behaviors in your
Mm-hmm.
mind and looking at it from almost a bird's eye view, I suppose, if you
Mm-hmm.
can, without, even though shame is an emotion and experience, without really like feeling
Because
into
it's
like
visceral. Like shame is
it's
such a
visceral.
somatic, visceral experience or feeling. What I don't, the words don't really matter to me. I mean, as you said, we often feel it in our gut. A lot of studies show that it's very subdiaphragmatic in where it truly does manifest within our bodies. But the similarities in which many of us experience shame is pretty astounding, and how parts of us, when I have a client turned in, and they're speaking for a part's experiences there with it, they're like, oh, it's dark and it feels like tar, and it's,
Mm,
it's, I mean, there's really no other way to get to know shame, to help it lessen, to help it really shed the light that Brene Brown speaks of, unless we're truly in relationship with it and hearing it from the part itself, what it's like carrying it. Then that's where we get to help unburden it and help it lessen both the emotion and or the extreme role in which it's engaging in to put it out or to stave it off.
right. I have a question, because you and I being in the mental health industry and within the I.F.S world, uh, I hear this a lot. I'm sure that you hear this a lot when you have a client, like, or I guess whether you have a client turned in or not. And I so frequently hear like, "Oh, my shame part. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
my shame part this." And we just went through how
Yeah.
all parts carry shame. Like, does the infamous shame part exist in the way that you think it's, or you hear it spoken? Because I have my opinion, obviously.
Um, my very strong opinion is
Mhm.
no, we don't
Right.
have a shame part. Because remember, every single part of us can feel and experience the vast range of all emotions.
Mm.
So we may have parts that carry shame more dominantly as one of their more uh, core emotions, or the emotion they feel most frequently. However, in my opinion, my very strong opinion is that no, we don't have a shame part, just like we don't have an angry part.
Mhm.
Um, so no, No, in my opinion, no, it's not a shame part. Again, I think sometimes it can get a little rigid with people using IFS that, oh, my angry part, my shame part. And those kind of titles can be valuable at times. However, it can also be a bit limiting and rigid.
Well, and I think it's a good starting. So I mean, naturally, you've taught me most of what I know about I.F.S.
Which means you
as
don't
far
know
as
very much. I'm very sorry. You might want to deepen your
my understanding.
exposure.
I said most. No, I'm just kidding. And yeah, I'm like, neither of us know very much. Let's start a podcast about it. And yeah, so I definitely agree. I don't think there's by any means a shame part. And I will say I really do appreciate when people are just in the beginning stages and start using that language because like obviously naturally reminds me of Inside Out, the movie, that Disney Pixar movie, because there were tons of, that was really IFS inspired. I don't think a lot of people know that. They consulted with a lot of IFS therapists and professionals, and that is kind of the way that it's easily talked about in society, even the way that it was broken down in that movie. There is an angry part and a sad part and a joy part. And I think that's a good way to like introduce it. However, really, yeah, that's just the like,
our parts aren't that simplistic.
Yeah, it's barely
it'd be cool if they were. It'd be able to, it'd be super cool if they were that simplistic. And it gives a good context, but our parts deserve more experience than just that.
Our parts are a lot more deep than just like a cookie cutter, like this is my joy and this is my shame, etc. I just wanted to bring that up because that is probably, and actually, interestingly enough, because you made the comment about how shame and rage are felt frequently, the most frequent two I think I hear are like my shame part and my anger part. And everything else is given the and those are like probably the two that we're most shy to explore a lot of times, where everything else is given the depth and exploration that it
shame and rage don't generally feel super safe, and they're not easy to talk about because they're not easy to feel, right? And rage and anger are different. Rage is a biological feeling that is so deeply primitive and genetically embedded within our system that when we actually feel rage, it's the desire to keep ourselves alive by whatever means necessary, right? Where anger's a lot less intense than that. But sorry, I just went off.
No, I'm glad that you said, getting off on the anger territory. I'm glad that you said that, because shame and rage, talking about, that it's the survival instinct where I have to do this to stay alive, where anger is more of the emotive, less of the actual like physical sensation and more of the emotive. So that's interesting. Anyways, shame.
I wish you had a bell to be ringing.
That's so funny because I was doing shame. I can get one.
It might. Maybe next time
I could just ring the little bell. Yeah, okay.
Or maybe cowbell. We can introduce cowbell into shame.
I'll wake up my neighbors. We record at like 6 a.m. Shame! I'm gonna get the cops called on me. What else? As far as I feel really grateful for that breakdown and how you've and you're just really gifted at this, Amy, where you do your system, whatever it is, you're very talented at dovetailing and weaving these things together in a way that makes sense. So thank you for explaining that, because you and I haven't had such a formal shame conversation in our relationship before, as much as many groups as I've watched, etc. And it really does, like, it goes side by side, those shame resilience steps and this and I.F.S, and then talking about the unburdening and the deepening process. It just makes so much sense. Is there anything else as far as our listeners Anything else as far as shame is concerned that you want to share with our listeners?
No, because I think anything else I go into will just be completely who knows where it goes, and so I think it feels complete for me.
It feels complete for me too, knowing that in some of our upcoming episodes, we have a guest coming on in a couple of weeks. Our episode will be out where shame is inherently going to be woven into that conversation, and then you and I have some other really cool conversations as well. So knowing that we will simplify and deepen.
And since we uncovered, right, shame is a part of it all, it seems like, in some way, shape, or form. It'll always be interwoven. I'm sure.
It'll always be interwoven, and it's cool to talk about directly because it is interwoven in every aspect. It's like you can see it. You can see it in pretty simple terms when you look at things with the lens of shame in mind, not through the lens of shame, but with the lens of shame in mind. It's really in like everything we do on some minute level.
Assuming parts of us are driving the bus, right?
Right. Yeah. Forgetting self entirely.
Yeah. Right. If we're in self, or at least a decent amount of self, usually shame is not quite as prevalent, but
not quite as much. Well, I love you very much. Thank you.
I love you very much. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. All right, everybody. Thank you as always for tuning in to the Turning In podcast. Like I said, we've got some really cool episodes coming up. I hope that you continue to enjoy. I'm not going to beg today for you to follow us on Instagram, like us on Spotify, or give us a review on Apple. However, I will just mention that I'm not going to beg.
I'm not going to beg, but I will say it.
Yeah, I'm not going to beg, but I'll just mention that those are some options that you may or may not choose to partake in. And I just really appreciate you choosing or not choosing to do that is all. No, we really love you guys. The support has been awesome. Continue to tune in if you're interested in I.F.S. I feel like this thing has been pretty cool. And some of the conversations that we've been able to have because of it are pretty magical. So thanks for your time, and we will see you next time.